Oak. Ash-gray light was still bleeding into the Montana sky when the town of Harlan Crossing heard the first scream of the night. Not the first of that week. Not the first of that month. The first of that particular Tuesday, which meant there were at least 4 more to come before morning. Oak. The neighbors on Sycamore Street had long since learned to sleep with their windows shut and their consciences buried somewhere beneath the floorboards, right alongside every other inconvenient truth about what happened inside the Voss household. For 2.5 years they heard everything. They did nothing. But the winter of 1883 had a way of dragging things out into the open that men preferred to keep hidden. And on the coldest night of that long, wretched season, the ice brought something down from the high ridges of the Bitterroot Mountains that Harlan Crossing had never bargained for. Seraphine Voss was 23 years old, though she looked closer to 35. Not because she was careless about her appearance. She was meticulous, actually. She had to be. She had become an expert in the architecture of concealment. The high lace collar on a Tuesday. The long-sleeved wool dress in September heat. The powder she mixed herself in the small ceramic bowl beneath the washstand. The precise shade of ivory that could flatten a bruise to something that looked merely like tiredness, if you didn't look too long, and in Harlan Crossing, nobody looked too long. Her name before the marriage had been Seraphine Aldgate. She had been the second daughter of a cattle broker who drank more than he brokered, a man who smiled wide at church on Sundays and couldn't meet his creditors' eyes on Mondays. When Dorian Voss had come calling in the spring of 1880, her father had practically pushed her out the door. Dorian was 41 to her 20, owner of the only land title office in 3 counties, a man who wore his authority like a well-tailored coat. He had a broad, square jaw, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, and the practiced charm of someone who understood exactly how much a good impression was worth. He brought Seraphine wildflowers the first time he called. He brought her father a promissory note the second time, and a settlement agreement the third. She had believed, with the desperate optimism of a young woman who had never been shown what a safe man actually looked like, that she was being rescued. The first time Dorian hit her, they had been married 11 days. It was over a letter. She had written to her younger sister Willa, without asking permission first, a detail she hadn't known required permission. Dorian had found the envelope on the writing table and read it, not because he suspected anything, but because he read everything in that house. Every scrap of paper was his. Every word spoken inside those walls was his. Every breath she took was, in his estimation, a privilege he extended at his discretion. He had come into the parlor holding the letter between 2 fingers as though it were a dead rodent, and he had looked at her with a calm, measured contempt that frightened her far more than shouting would have. "You correspond with family," he had said. "When I say you correspond with family." And then, before she had even processed the sentence, his open hand caught her across the face hard enough to spin her into the corner of the writing desk. She had crouched there, holding her cheek, looking up at him with pure shock, and Dorian had folded the letter, placed it in his breast pocket, straightened his cuffs, and walked to the kitchen to ask for his supper. That was the beginning. By the end of the first year, Seraphine had mapped the geography of Dorian's temper the way a ship's navigator charts a coastline full of hidden rocks. She knew the particular tightening around his eyes that meant a bad day at the office. She knew the way he poured his bourbon, too much without ceremony. That meant she needed to make herself invisible before he finished the glass. She knew that Mondays were dangerous after town council meetings, that Fridays were unpredictable after the mail arrived from Helena, and that her own voice, pitched even slightly above a certain muted register, was something she could not afford. He never touched her face if they were expected at the Reverend's dinner that week. He had a gentleman's precision about it, a care for appearances that was somehow more chilling than pure rage would have been. Dorian Voss wasn't out of control. He was entirely in control. He was simply a man who had decided, quietly and completely, that his wife was an object, and objects did not require consideration. Harlan Crossing knew. The town was not large enough, nor the walls of the Voss house thick enough, for the truth to remain entirely sealed inside. Mrs. Pruitt, the seamstress 2 lots over, heard the breaking of dishes on a Tuesday night in November and quietly went on hemming her curtains. Deputy Aldred Kane had been called to Sycamore Street once. in the early days, when a traveling medicine salesman had gone to the marshal's office and reported seeing a woman through a window being thrown against a wall. Marshal Holt Greer had sent Kane. Kane had knocked, Dorian had answered, smooth and composed, explained his wife had taken a dizzy spell, and offered the deputy a glass of whiskey for the trouble. Kane had accepted the whiskey. He had not gone back inside. Dorian owned the land title records for half the properties in Harlan Crossing. He held 3 mortgages on Main Street businesses, including the building that housed the marshal's office. He was the man who approved the transfer deeds when a family needed to sell in a hurry. In a frontier town built on land and leverage, Dorian Voss was untouchable in the way that only truly dangerous men ever are. Not through physical dominance, but through the systemic, suffocating grip of financial power. By the second winter, Seraphine had stopped trying to leave. The one time she had tried, a Tuesday in February when the beating had split the skin above her eyebrow and left her dizzy for 2 days. She had made it 4 blocks through the frozen mud before Marshal Greer's wagon had pulled alongside her. Greer hadn't been unkind. That was almost the worst part. He had been gentle and apologetic and entirely useless. He had draped his coat over her shoulders and driven her right back to the house on Sycamore Street, talking the whole way in a low voice about the importance of patience in a marriage, about how Dorian was a pillar of the community, about how these things had a way of working themselves out. Dorian had been standing on the porch when the wagon rolled up. He had helped her down himself, one firm hand beneath her elbow, smiling pleasantly at Greer. The marshal had tipped his hat and turned the wagon around without looking back. The beating that followed kept her bedridden for 5 days. Dorian told the Reverend's wife she had influenza. By the time the winter of 1883 arrived, Seraphine had been reduced to something she no longer fully recognized. She weighed barely 95 pounds. Her honey-colored hair, which had once reached her waist in thick, heavy waves, she now wore pinned up tight and close because Dorian had grabbed it too many times, and she had learned to offer him nothing to take hold of. She moved through the house like a shadow, functionally invisible, cataloging exits and angles out of a habit so deeply ingrained she no longer even consciously registered it. She had stopped praying for rescue. She had started praying simply for it to end one way or another. The night it changed was the 14th of December. A storm had been building in the Bitterroots for 3 days, massing behind the peaks like something old and patient. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. By nightfall, the snow was coming sideways down Sycamore Street, and the wind had a sound to it like something enormous drawing breath. Dorian had ridden to Missoula that morning for a land dispute hearing. The hearing had not gone in his favor. The federal land commissioner had sided with a homesteading family whose deed Dorian had disputed for 18 months, and the loss represented not just money but a public humiliation in front of men whose opinions Dorian treated like currency. He had ridden back through the beginning of the blizzard rather than waited out in Missoula, which told Seraphine everything she needed to know about the state he would arrive in. She heard his horse in the yard at 7:30. She heard the stable door bang. She heard his boots on the porch steps, heavy, deliberate, each one landing like a verdict. She was standing at the kitchen stove when he came through the back door. She didn't speak. She had learned that speaking was an invitation. He didn't take his coat off. He walked directly to the kitchen table, sat down, and looked at her with an expression she had catalogued hundreds of times. The cold, assessing look of a man deciding how much damage was appropriate for the offense of existing in his presence on a bad day. The supper wasn't ready. That was enough. What followed was not something Seraphine could track moment by moment afterward. There was the table. There was the floor. There was the particular sound of her wrist bending in a direction it was not built to bend, a sound she felt more than heard. There was his voice, very calm, very controlled, telling her exactly what she was worth and what she had cost him and how thoroughly she had failed at being even the minimal thing he had required her to be. There was the cold of the kitchen floor beneath her cheek. There was the thought, distant and oddly peaceful, that this might genuinely be the last one. She was still on the floor when the back door opened. Not from Dorian leaving, from something else entering. The man who stepped through the broken doorframe, because the door was no longer quite on its hinges, had to duck to clear the top of the frame. He was wrapped in a coat made of wolf hide and river mink, layered and enormous, caked with snow and ice along the hem. His boots were moccasins wrapped in elk hide. He smelled of frozen pine resin and wood smoke and something ancient and cold. Oak. He was broad through the chest and shoulders in the way that men who have survived years of physical labor become broad. Not cultivated, not decorative, simply structural. Oak. His name was Beckett Crane. The few people in the high country who knew him at all called him Crane, which was almost funny given the size of him. He was a trapper and a surveyor by trade, a former cavalry scout who had gone into the mountains after the Nez Perce campaign, and simply not come back out except for the 2 or 3 times a year when he needed to trade pelts. He was 44 years old and had not slept inside a proper building in 11 months. Oak. The blizzard had forced him down. He had intended to reach the livery and sleep in a stall with his mules. He had been cutting behind the houses on Sycamore Street, following the fence line in the whiteout, when he had put his hand against the back wall of the Voss house to steady himself in a gust, and heard the specific, unmistakable sound of a human body hitting a floor. Oak. He had stood there in the blizzard for approximately 4 seconds. Oak. Then he had put his shoulder through the door. Oak. Dorian spun around. He was still in his coat, his face flushed dark with exertion and cold, and his first response was the automatic, habitual fury of a man whose property had been intruded upon. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to projecting, the authority that had always worked before on deputies and debtors and terrified wives. "I don't know who you are, but you will get out of my..." Oak. Crane looked at him for a moment, then he looked at Seraphine on the floor, then he looked back at Dorian. Oak. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides. Oak. Dorian grabbed for the short-barreled pistol he kept in his coat pocket. His fingers had just closed around the grip when Crane's hand closed around his wrist with a force that made the small bones of Dorian's hand creak and bend. The pistol clattered onto the flagstone floor. Dorian looked up into a pair of dark brown eyes, the color of creek water in October, and saw something that had never been directed at him before. Complete and absolute indifference to his power. Oak. "You got no idea who you're dealing with," Dorian said, his voice fracturing slightly. "I own half this county. I'll have you in chains by morning." Oak. "You won't," Crane said. His voice was low and unhurried, roughened by years of speaking only to mountains and animals. He said it not as a threat but as a simple correction of fact. Oak. He hit Dorian once. An open-palmed strike to the chest that drove him backward into the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Dorian slid down the wall, wheezing, all the air gone from him in a single catastrophic instant. He sat on the kitchen floor, gasping and staring upward with the particular expression of a man who has, for the first time in his life, come into contact with a consequence. Oak. Crane turned away from him and knelt beside Seraphine. Oak. She flinched back. She couldn't help it. The flinching was involuntary by now, a learned reflex as automatic as breathing. Any large shape moving quickly toward her triggered it. Oak. "I know," Crane said quietly. He didn't reach for her. He stayed where he was, letting her see his hands, keeping his voice low and even. "I'm not going to touch you until you say it's all right." Oak. She looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were enormous and scarred and entirely still. She looked at his face, which was weathered and half hidden by a dark beard shot through with frost, but which held an expression she hadn't seen on a man's face in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Concern without agenda. "Oak. My wrist," she said. Her voice was barely there. Oak. "I can see it. Can I look?" Oak. She nodded. Oak. He examined the wrist with a careful, practiced gentleness that completely contradicted everything about his appearance. He had set bones before, both animal and human, in situations where there was no doctor within 40 miles. "Broken," he said. "Clean across. I can splint it here, but we can't stay." Oak. Behind them, Dorian had found enough air to speak. "Greer," he shouted toward the broken door, his voice thin but already rebuilding its malice. "Marshal Greer, he's in here. He assaulted me." Oak. The marshal's office was 4 streets over. The blizzard was loud. Oak. But Marshal Greer had 2 deputies who made rounds regardless of weather, and one of them had been less than a block away. Within minutes, the sound of boots on the porch. Oak. Crane helped Seraphine to her feet, with one hand braced beneath her good arm. She stood, shaking, the cold from the broken door washing over her in waves. He reached back without looking and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the pack he'd dropped in the doorway. wrapping it around her shoulders with the efficient care of someone accustomed to treating injuries in the field. Oak. Deputy Aldred Kane stepped into the kitchen doorway, gun drawn, eyes moving fast between Dorian on the floor and the enormous stranger, and the pale, injured woman wrapped in a stranger's blanket. Oak. Step away from Mrs. Voss, Kane said. His gun hand was shaking. He had heard the stories about what came down from the Bitterroot sometimes, the men who had gone feral up in the high country. He did not want this assignment. Oak. Crane turned to face him. He didn't step away from Seraphine. He stood in front of her, not aggressively, but simply as a fact of physics, something between her and the door. Oak. You've been to this house before, Crane said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the resignation in Seraphine's face when she heard the boots on the porch. Not hope, just a dull, resigned absence of expectation. That told him everything about the relationship between this woman and the law in Harlan Crossing. Oak. Kane's jaw tightened. Oak. You have a gun on me, Crane continued. Use it or lower it, but I'm telling you plainly, I'm taking her out of this house. Tonight. He glanced toward Dorian, who was leveraging himself upright against the wall holding his chest. You want to stop me? You'd better decide if it's worth it. Oak. The kitchen was silent, except for the blizzard tearing through the broken door frame. Oak. Kane looked at Seraphine. He looked at her wrist, bent at its wrong angle. He looked at the blood at the corner of her mouth. He had known, in the abstract general way that people in small towns know things they do not examine directly, what this house was. He had accepted it as one of those immovable facts of the community, like bad roads in spring or poor harvests in drought years. Standing in the kitchen with it made physical and unavoidable before him, the abstract became unbearable. Oak. He lowered the gun. Oak. Marshal Greer hears about this, Kane said, looking at a point somewhere between them rather than directly at either of them. That's not something I can control. Oak. I know, Crane said. That's fine. Oak. He lifted Seraphine. She made a sound against his shoulder when her wrist shifted, a controlled, strangled sound that she cut off immediately, which told him she had learned to be quiet about pain the way other people learn to be quiet about grief, through long practice and necessity. He pulled the wolf-hide coat around her, settling its weight across her small frame. Oak. You're going to be all right, he said against her hair, very quietly, not performing it for anyone in the room, just saying it because he knew it to be true and believed she needed to hear it from someone who meant it. Oak. He walked out of the house into the blizzard. Oak. The cold was immediate and annihilating. The snow had drifted to knee-height against the fence, and the wind drove ice crystals at a horizontal angle into any exposed skin. But Crane moved through it with the calm economy of a man, for whom this temperature was not emergency but simply weather. He had cached his 2 mules at the livery. He stopped there long enough to pull additional blankets from the pack and wrap Seraphine more fully, then began the climb toward the high country. Oak. She passed in and out of consciousness. In her brief waking moments, she was aware of the steady motion, the solid warmth of him, the way the sound of the blizzard seemed different from inside his arms, still loud, still violent, but somehow external, something happening to the world rather than to her. At one point she said, very softly, "Why are you doing this?" Oak. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, same reason I'd pull a hawk out of a trap. It doesn't belong in one. Oak. She didn't say anything after that. She pressed her face against the rough wool of his shirt and let the motion carry her. Oak. The cabin was at the 8,000-foot mark, tucked against a granite overhang that blocked the worst of the north wind. Crane had built it himself over 3 seasons, notch by notch, filling the gaps with clay and elk hair. It was a single room with a stone hearth, a plank bed frame heaped with cured hides, a workbench and shelves of tins and dried goods. Oak. It smelled of pine smoke and tobacco and cured leather, and when he got the fire going it filled with orange warmth so quickly it seemed to exhale in relief. Oak. He set the wrist that night. He did it fast and without preamble, which was the only merciful way to do it. Seraphine went white and then gray, and then she was unconscious again, which he preferred. It meant she didn't have to be present for the splinting. He used 2 flat pieces of pine from the woodpile and strips of clean linen from his kit, wrapping the break with a steady, careful pressure. Oak. The fever came the next day, climbing through her in waves that left her soaked and shaking. She was delirious for 4 days, and in her delirium she was back in the house on Sycamore Street, always back there, waiting for the boots on the stairs. She would cry out and thrash against the elk hides. Crane stayed. Oak. He replaced the cold compresses on her forehead at regular intervals, fed spoonfuls of broth into her when she had brief moments of lucidity, kept the fire at a steady moderate heat through the nights. He did not sleep much. He had learned on campaign that sleep was optional in a way that vigilance was not. Oak. When the fever broke on the 5th day, Seraphine came back into herself slowly, the way people do after long illness, surfacing in stages. The first thing she was aware of was the silence. Not the silence of a house where she was holding her breath, waiting, but the clean, indifferent silence of the mountains. The second thing was the smell of coffee. Oak. Crane was at the workbench cleaning a rifle when she sat up. He glanced at her. Hungry? Oak. Yes, she said, surprised by it. She hadn't been hungry in so long, she'd forgotten that hunger was separate from being alive. Oak. He brought her a tin cup of broth and a piece of dense cornbread, and sat on the stool across from the bed while she ate, not watching her precisely, but present in the careful, peripheral way of someone paying attention, without making a performance of it. Oak. You don't talk much, she said after a while. Oak. Mountains don't need talking to, he said. I got out of the habit. Oak. She looked around the cabin, the pelts on the walls, the neatly organized shelves, the Sharp's rifle above the mantel, and the worn Bible beside it. Do you read? She asked. Oak. Some. You? Oak. My mother taught me, before she died. She turned the tin cup in her one good hand. Dorian didn't approve of women reading, said it gave them ideas above their station. Oak. Crane looked at the fire. He was right about that part, he said, very dryly, and something cracked open in Seraphine's chest. The unfamiliar, almost forgotten pressure of a laugh, which came out more like a breath, but was real. Oak. She healed slowly, and then all at once, the way bones do. By February, she was chopping kindling, one-handed, and irritating Crane with questions about the snare sets, until he started taking her along to check them. He showed her how to read the direction of a track, how to estimate the weight of an animal from the depth of its print, how to move through snow without announcing herself. She was a quick study. Oak. She had always been quick. She had survived 2.5 years of Dorian Voss by being quick, and now, for the first time, she was applying that same attention to things that were worth learning. Oak. Her hands grew calloused, her cheeks grew color, she stopped flinching at sudden sounds. Oak. In the evenings they talked, or sat in companionable quiet, which was its own form of conversation. She learned that Crane had fought at Bear Paw and come away from it not wounded in the body but in some other, harder-to-name place, and that the mountains had been a way of getting distance from a world that made too much noise about things it didn't understand. He learned that she had once been studying to teach, before her father's debts had closed that road. Oak. He started leaving books on the shelf beside her side of the bed, without comment. Oak. The love that grew between them was not a dramatic thing. It had no single moment. It was the accumulation of small truths. The way he moved the second lamp closer when she was reading, without being asked. The way she started leaving his coffee cup on the exact spot on the workbench where his hand would reach for it, without looking. The way they stood shoulder to shoulder in the door of the cabin some evenings, watching the sun go down behind the peaks. Not talking, not needing to. Oak. Down in Harlan Crossing, the silence from Sycamore Street had not gone unremarked. Oak. Dorian Voss was not a man who absorbed a loss. He had 3 cracked ribs, a wounded pride, and a filing cabinet full of motivations. He did not go to Marshal Greer this time. Greer was useful for routine maintenance of the social order, but for a problem that had gone as far off the rails as this, Greer was inadequate. Dorian sent a telegram to a man in Butte. Oak. The man's name was Renner Silk. He was not the kind of man whose name appeared in newspapers unless a death had occurred. He had a long record of successful retrievals, the polite word bounty hunters used for bringing people back against their will, and he charged accordingly. Dorian hired him in March and told him to wait for the passes to clear. Oak. By May, the snow was pulling back from the lower slopes. The passes were running with meltwater but traversable. Renner Silk and 2 men he'd brought up from Butte began their ascent, following the survey lines Crane had filed 3 years prior with the Territorial Land Office. Information Dorian had, because Dorian had access to every piece of paper that moved through Harlan Crossing. Oak. Crane had told her in early spring about the possibility of someone coming. He had said it plainly, in the same tone he used to describe weather patterns and wildlife behavior. A factual assessment of risk. He had taught her to shoot that same week. He put a Winchester in her hands and stood behind her, adjusting her stance with impersonal precision, his hands on her shoulders, and said, "You lean into it. Don't fight the weight of it. Let it be part of you." Oak. She had practiced for 2 weeks until her shoulder ached and her aim became something she didn't have to think about. Oak. "Will they come?" she'd asked one evening. Oak. "Men like Dorian always send someone," Crane had said. "He doesn't know how to leave a loss alone." Oak. She had nodded. She had understood that about Dorian before she understood almost anything else about him. Oak. The morning Renner Silk arrived at the timberline was a morning like any other in the high country, cold and blue-skied and entirely indifferent to the plans of men. Crane had gone to the eastern ridge to check a line of traps. Seraphine was inside, mending a tear in one of the elk hides when she heard the horses. Oak. Not the casual movement of a deer through brush, the deliberate, careful movement of horses whose riders were trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. Oak. She set down the hide, she crossed to the far wall, she lifted the Winchester from its pegs. Oak. She opened the cabin door and stood in it. Oak. There were 3 of them picking their way through the scrub pine at the tree line. Renner Silk in the lead, a compact gray-eyed man with a hunter's patient stillness, his 2 men flanking him slightly behind. That stopped when they saw her in the doorway, and registered visibly that she was not cowering, that she was armed, that she was standing in her own doorway with the particular posture of a woman who had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. Oak. Silk held up one hand, palm out. "Easy, ma'am. I'm here on behalf of your husband. He's concerned for your welfare." Oak. "He isn't," Seraphine said. Oak. "Mrs. Voss, I have a legal document here." Oak. "My name is Seraphine Aldgate," she said. It was the first time she had said it. It came out clean and firm and completely natural, as if the other name had been a garment she'd been forced to wear and had now simply removed. "Dorian Voss's documents have no authority up here. You know that." Oak. Silk's eyes moved to the Winchester, calculating. "I'm not going to force you," he said, which was the standard line, the one he used when an immediate approach wasn't viable. "I'm just here to convey Mr. Voss's invitation to return." "Oak. Convey my refusal," Seraphine said. Oak. One of Silk's men shifted his horse sideways, a positioning move, trying to angle toward the side of the cabin. Seraphine moved the barrel of the Winchester without hurry, and the man stopped. Oak. "This is the only conversation we're going to have," Seraphine said. Her voice was level and dry, and there was nothing in it that any of the 3 men could take hold of. "You can tell Dorian Voss that I'm alive. You can tell him I intend to stay that way. And you can tell him that if anyone comes up this mountain again, they will not come back down. I spent 2.5 years being afraid of that man. I'm done." Oak. She was aware of movement in the tree line to her left. Not alarmed by it, she recognized the particular cadence of it. Oak. Crane stepped out of the pines onto the open slope. He was carrying the sharps, not raised, just carried, his broad frame moving with the unhurried economy of a man entirely at home. He stopped a few yards out and stood still, looking at Silk and his men with the same mild, assessing expression he used on everything that entered his territory. Oak. Silk looked at Crane. He looked at Seraphine. He did the arithmetic that all experienced men in his profession did. The assessment of cost against contract, risk against reward. The man who had hired him was a land agent in a valley town. The woman in the doorway had a Winchester and no fear. The man beside her looked like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself and was approximately as easy to move. Oak. And the contract was Dorian's money against all of this. Oak. Silk lowered his hand. He turned his horse. "I'll communicate your position to Mr. Voss," he said, the professional neutrality of a man closing a file. Oak. "Do that," Seraphine said. Oak. They watched the 3 horses pick their way back down the slope and disappear into the lower timber. Crane came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at the Winchester in her hands. Then he looked at her face. Oak. "All right," he said. Oak. "Yes," she said, and she meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in a very long time. Oak. Down in Harlan Crossing, Dorian Voss received Renner Silk's report 2 weeks later and made his final mistake. He went to the Territorial Land Commissioner in Helena and filed a formal complaint against Beckett Crane, alleging theft of property, specifically his wife, and seeking a warrant. Oak. The commissioner, who had ruled against Dorian in the land dispute in December, read the complaint, set it on his desk, and asked Dorian exactly one question. Had his wife filed a complaint herself, or expressed a desire to return? Oak. Dorian said no, she was being held against her will. Oak. The commissioner sent a deputy north to Harlan Crossing to investigate. The deputy spoke with 7 people before he'd been in town 3 hours. He spoke with the seamstress 2 lots over from the Voss house. He spoke with a woman at the dry goods store who had seen Seraphine's collarbone in July of 1881. Oak. He spoke with Deputy Aldred Kane, who had lowered his gun in a kitchen in December and spent the subsequent months living with what he had enabled for 2 years prior, and who was, by May, ready to speak about it plainly and at length. Oak. The deputy went back to Helena. He wrote his report. The warrant that was issued in June of 1884 was not for Becket Crane. Oak. It was for Dorian Voss. Oak. Marshal Greer, presented with a territorial warrant he could not simply file away, made the arrest on a Thursday morning. He did it quietly and quickly, and without looking any of his neighbors in the eye, because he understood by that point that the town's reputation for looking away was something that was going to take years to live down, and that he bore a particular share of it. Oak. The trial was brief. The evidence was not. Oak. Seraphine did not come down for the trial. She sent a written statement with the territorial deputy, 6 pages in a careful, steady hand, and that statement was read into the record by the prosecutor, while the courtroom was so quiet that people in the back rows could hear the clock on the wall. Oak. She never went back to Harlan Crossing. Oak. She and Crane moved east the following spring, following the survey work into the high country above the Musselshell. She filed a homestead claim in her own name, Aldgate as she had given it, on a piece of land where the ponderosa pines grew so thick they blocked the midday sun and a creek ran clear all 12 months of the year. They built the house together over 2 summers, notching the logs, laying the stone hearth, cutting the cedar shingles by hand. Oak. It was the kind of work that suited them both. Oak. She started a school the 3rd winter, teaching the children of 3 neighboring homesteading families in the front room on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which was the thing she had always been going to do, before the world had briefly and violently interrupted her. Oak. The last letter she ever received from Harlan Crossing came from Deputy Kane, 8 months after the trial. It was short. He said that Dorian had received 12 years, that the house on Sycamore Street had been sold, and that he hoped she was well. He said he was sorry he had not done more sooner. He said he understood if she didn't write back. Oak. She read the letter twice, sitting at the desk by the window where the morning light came through the pines in long, golden bars. Then she folded it, set it down, and went back to the lesson she'd been preparing. Oak. Outside, the creek was loud with snowmelt, and the peaks above were the particular pure white of a winter that was finally genuinely ending. Oak. She did not write back to Kane. But she thought about what she might have said, sometimes, in the way that people think about things they have already moved past. Not with bitterness, not with urgency, but with the clear-eyed distance of someone who can finally afford to look back, because they are no longer facing the direction the wind came from. Oak. The mountains had given her that. The silence, the cold, the brutal honesty of a world that didn't care about social standing or financial leverage, only about whether you were capable and present and real. She had learned what she was made of up here, and it turned out she was made of something better than she had ever been told. Oak. There is a particular kind of strength that grows in the places where everything else has been stripped away. Seraphine Aldgate had found it in the worst winter of her life, at 8,000 feet, in a one-room cabin that smelled of pine smoke and slowly, steadily became home. And she had carried it back down with her, not to the life she'd been forced into, but to the life she had always been capable of building, if someone had only thought to hand her the tools. Oak. I think about Seraphine standing in that cabin doorway a lot. Not the version of her from the beginning of the story, the one who had learned to breathe shallowly so her ribs wouldn't grind, who had memorized the sound of boots on stairs the way other women memorize hymns. I think about the version at the end. Winchester in her hands, feet planted, voice level, telling Renner Silk her name, her real name, like it was something she'd just found again after losing it in a drawer for years. Oak. That moment didn't come from nowhere. That's the thing people miss when they hear a story like this. They want to find the miracle in it, the single turning point, the man who kicked through the door and fixed everything. But Becket Crane didn't fix Seraphine. He just stopped the immediate damage long enough for her to fix herself. Oak. And she could only do that because somewhere underneath everything Dorian had spent 2.5 years trying to destroy, there was something left that hadn't gone out. Oak. What strikes me about her is that she was always intelligent. She had mapped Dorian's moods like a navigator maps reefs. Precisely, obsessively, because her survival depended on it. That same mind, turned towards snare lines and track depth and Winchester sights, became something else entirely. Intelligence doesn't disappear under pressure. It redirects, it finds whatever channel is open. Oak. Seraphine's didn't break. It just had nowhere useful to go until Crane handed her a different problem to solve. Oak. And then there's the question of character. Not in a grand abstract sense. In the small, daily sense. The kind that shows up in whether you tell the truth when lying would be easier. Whether you lower your gun when you know you should, even if it costs you something. Whether you write a letter to someone who wronged you or simply move on and let the creek be loud and the peaks be white and let that be enough. Kane lowered his gun. It took him 2 years too long and he carried that, and then when it mattered he did the right thing. Seraphine didn't write back to him, but she thought about what she might have said. Those are small moral choices. They accumulate into the shape of a life. The perseverance piece is the one that gets me most. Not the dramatic kind. Not the moment she pulled the trigger or stood in the doorway. The kind that happened in February, when her shoulder was bruised black from the rifle practice and her wrist was still healing, and she went out into the snow anyway and checked the snare line and came back and started again the next day. That's the part that doesn't make it into the legend. The ordinary, grinding, unglamorous work of becoming someone who can survive. She did it without anyone watching. That's how you know it was real. Dorian had every structural advantage. Money, law, social standing, a marshal on his payroll. What he didn't have was the capacity to grow. He was a man who had stopped developing somewhere early and had spent the rest of his life forcing the world to accommodate the shape he'd already decided he was. When that stopped working, he had nothing to fall back on. That's not fate or karma in any mystical sense. It's just the natural consequence of a person who invests everything in controlling others and nothing in becoming something worth being. Seraphine started a school. She built a house with her own hands. She taught children on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. That's what the story is actually about, I think. Not the rescue. Not the revenge. The Tuesday mornings. The life she always should have had, finally, stubbornly, quietly lived.